Thou hast ascended in glory, O Christ our God, granting joy to thy disciples by the promise of the Holy Spirit. Through thy blessing they were assured that thou art the Son of God, the Redeemer of the world. So, so we read a fair amount last week of some of the original sources on St. Herman. And this week I'd like to talk a little bit more about St. Innocent and maybe St. Iakov Netsvetov. I've gone over their histories briefly. St. Innocent came, excuse me. St. Innocent came about 1824 to Unalaska, which is it's an island in the Aleutian chain, fairly close in to the Alaska mainland, only a few hundred miles out. There with his mother, his wife, his son, and I think his brother, they built a house, they built a church, and started the missionary work. He went and had this rather extraordinary ministry where he learned the Aleut language, because these people were Aleuts, put it into writing and published, translated documents, and in fact wrote a document called the Pathway to the Kingdom of Heaven, as well as liturgical texts, the Gospel of Matthew, and then taught the natives to read and write their own language. So that's a remarkable thing, I think. He traveled all over the place, then in all over the Aleutian area where he evangelized the natives. We'll go into some detail and read the account of his encounter with a shaman, and how that all happened. It's the encounter of the Orthodox missionaries with the Aleutian people is quite extraordinary in missionary terms, because these people were very much ready to receive the gospel. Their previous culture, previous religion had prepared them to accept the message of the gospel. They recognized the moral system. They recognized the some of the basic concepts. They were never idolaters. Of course, there were a lot of the Christian content. The Christian faith was in its specifics was alien to them, but they already were a faithful people and well disposed by nature towards Christianity. So we'll read a little bit about that. Then eventually he returned to Russia while he was in St. Petersburg giving a report and visiting Metropolitan Philaret of Moscow, one of the most significant figures in Russian Orthodox history of the 19th century. He found out his wife had died, and it took some convincing, but Metropolitan Philaret convinced him to become a monk and accept the episcopate and to go back and to establish a diocese there. Now, one of the things that's very interesting is if you do get a hold of this book and read it, Alaskan Missionary Spirituality, and read about Archimandrite Yosef, who was the head of the mission. He was the priest monk who oversaw the whole thing, and some long about 1797, I think, he returned to Russia and to make a report to the Holy Synod, in which he basically went and exposed the corruption of the the Russian America Company, which of course didn't go over very well. But he returned to Alaska only to find, well, actually only to be shipwrecked within sight of Kodiak Island, and all hands on board drowned. So he never made it back. But while he was there, he had been made a bishop, and with the full intention of establishing a diocese in Kodiak. He had also intended to start a seminary. There had been a couple of young men that had been sent to Russia, but it was a very difficult thing for Native Americans to go to Europe or even to Asia because their immunity did not cover or their immune systems could not handle the European diseases and the Eurasian diseases. Eurasia, of course, has a pretty similar set of diseases that all the way from China all to Europe, but that did not extend over the seas to North America. So at least one or two of these people that were sent over to Yakutsk to go to seminary and be trained as priests died of smallpox. And it was, of course, a disaster. So when Archimandrite Yosef went to Russia, his plan was also to start a seminary aimed at the native peoples of Alaska, but of course using Russian books and the contemporary Russian seminary method. And that was in 1799 that he returned. But he and all of the books and everything else, all the supplies, went into the ocean and drowned.
What do you think, they hit an iceberg, or is that covered in the book?
Nobody knows because everybody died. But parts of the ship washed up on the shores of Kodiak, which meant it was very close. Let's see. I think I'd mentioned that as when St. Innocent went to Russia, he returned safely to Kodiak, or rather he returned safely to Alaska, visited Kodiak, but the provincial capital was in Sitka, Novoarkhanghelsk. There he built the church. He built a big house for himself. Those are now part of they're now state monuments. Although the last Orthodox bishop of Alaska to live in that house was Metropolitan Theodosius, who occupied it, though my guess is it was in rather bad shape. And the church is in beautiful shape, and it's right in the middle, literally in the middle of the town of Sitka. And it's the Tlingit people there. Again, he learned the language, started translating, ministered to the people. But of course, as a bishop, his concerns were much greater than being simply a parish priest. Let's see. He was he had other people appointed there, but he used Sitka as a base, and because it was the provincial capital, he could get around Alaska much easier. And there was also by that time in the 1840s, a trade going back and forth between Alaska and California. Now in 1812, the Russians had established Fort Ross in Northern California. Let's see if I can bring that up. Okay. Let's see, can we share the screen? Yeah. Okay. Okay, Fort Ross is actually not that far, oops, when it comes down to it, from San Francisco, which is right here. You got Point Reyes Station. I lived for 10 years right there. Fort Ross was built on a little spit of land, and we'll show the pictures. Very close to the sea, out on very scenic place. Let's see. And the church that's there is the oldest church, oldest Orthodox church in California. It's the oldest Orthodox church in the continental United States. You can just see it here. And every year there are services there held by all of the various respective jurisdictions. The Russians had wanted to create a colony there, but given the weather in that part of California, there is almost no hope of growing anything. Grass will grow, mushrooms will grow, and redwood trees will grow, but not much else. So you can't grow wheat, you can't grow vegetables, you can't grow anything. So the fort had a whole series of farms in this area, just over the mountains. This, of course, is now really premier wine country. It's also quite a pain to get to. The border between Russian America and New Spain was right here. And this is the mouth of the Russian River. And this is called the Russian River. Napa Valley is over here, by the way. The fort was founded about 1812, and first at Bodega Bay, which is here, where it was quite indefensible because of the topography. But let's see if we can do this. Okay. So you can see the location of this right on this point of land above a beach. Only problem is when you go there in the summertime, you freeze in the morning because it's about 45 degrees. Then by the time it hits 10:30 or 11, it's 80 degrees. And by the time it's 2 o'clock, it's about 85 before it goes back down to 45. And the fog comes in. Anyway, so it's a very, very beautiful place. St. Innocent visited there, presumably with a full, episcopal regalia, and serving the liturgy. There was not a permanent priest at the fort. Priests were assigned to ships, and so would come and would stop at the fort, would baptize and marry and do funerals and all of that kind of thing. But there was never a resident priest at the fort, so it never really, that I know of, that it never functioned fully as a parish. From there, he went down to the Bay Area. Since he went by boat, he probably traveled down around and in through the Golden Gate. And he visited the Friars in San Francisco, at Mission San Francisco. I believe he may have visited shoot, where is it? He may have visited, well, he certainly visited some of the other missions. Mission San Jose is another prominent mission. And I'm drawing a blank. Anyway, and he visited Mission San Rafael. The farthest north that the Russian mission system, or the Spanish mission system got, and the farthest south that the Russian mission system got was Sonoma, which is here. And so there's a mission here. Let's see if I can find that. Oh, we don't want Mission Gardens.
Sonoma.
Well, anyway. It's very tempting to play with these, with this thing.
They had a golf club, it looks like.
Oh, they've got lots of golf clubs. They've got, yeah, I don't see it here. I used to spend a lot of time in that town. Huh. Well, somewhere in here. Huh. What's funny is that should be. Well, anyway, when you go into the mission, that's probably it. Yep. It's a typical Spanish mission, only on the small side. But when, when you go into the visitor center, there is a fresco on the wall of a Russian priest monk facing off against a Franciscan friar. And this mission was the meeting place between the two empires. I don't have it. Anyway.
Is the fresco from that time or is it a modern one?
I think it's modern.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Anyway, so St. Innocent made this grand trip down to the Bay Area. He had not heard about St. Peter the Aleut that I know of, but he was able to speak with the friars in fluent Latin because his all the seminary training was all in Latin at that time, and so they had a they had evidently quite a positive rapport, and he ended up making a barrel organ for one of the missions in the Bay Area that's still there. He was very handy, and there were he always kept busy, and so he had these hobbies that he would make things. He made clocks, he made organs, he made all of these things. And he comments in one of his writings that here there are those Franciscan Spanish friars singing their chants to the merry tunes of Russian dance music. So anyway, so the trip to California is a big deal for those of us from Northern California because he really, to have had that area trod by yet another saint. One of the things we used to do in the monasteries, we would have a whole kind of little pilgrimage trail around the Bay Area. We would go to the mission where Saint Herman, or where Saint Peter the Aleut lost his life. We would go to the cathedral built by Saint Tikhon. We would go to, of course, to the relics of Saint John of San Francisco. Saint Innocent had a vision, had his vision for the mission in America included the establishment of the diocese in San Francisco. So there's, then we would go to the monasteries and end up at Fort Ross. So it was a nice little pilgrimage for people to come to the Bay Area, and not exactly what you normally think about as a reason to go to San Francisco. Anyway, let's see, back to Alaska. St. Innocent returned to Alaska. He returned to Sitka. He got a seminary going in Sitka, or a pastoral school. And then he set about visiting the rest of his diocese, which not only was the parishes all over this area of Alaska and the Aleutians, not to mention the Pribilofs, but Kamchatka and Eastern Siberia, and all the way down to China. He was instrumental in the establishment of the city of Blagoveshchensk, which is right on the Amur River, which is the dividing line between China and Russia. There's another story, that's Sakhalin Island, where this is the Kamchatka Peninsula. Where he got stuck for the winter. In Petropavlovsk, which is right here. And with him, also stuck for the winter, was St. Nikolai of Japan. So St. Nikolai had 6 months with St. Innocent, where his entire outlook was turned around. And he decided to be a real missionary and not simply a chaplain to the Russian embassy. And so he emulated St. Innocent and continued, I believe, to be, some kind of contact with him, while he developed almost single-handedly the Church of Japan, which is still there with between 30 and 50,000 people and about 100 parishes. So, needless to say, Kamchatka is a rather rough place, given its location, but it was the main embarkment point for ships that would go to Alaska from Russia. Vladivostok is down here, and so I think people would probably sail over here and then go. He traveled all over Eastern Siberia, and he learned and ended up for several years in Yakutsk, which is here. Yakutsk is a rather large city now, but at the time, of course, it was quite small, and as you can see, it's a long way from anything. It's also pretty far north. It's on the Lena River, which is one of these massive rivers that actually, I believe, flows north and dumps into the Arctic Sea. Let's see. And it gets very cold there. 60 below zero is nothing unusual in the wintertime. I have a friend in Dallas who says, come and visit my home city. I'd love to show you around, but don't come in the winter, you will die, because it's so cold. So he made Yakutsk a base, and was Bishop of Yakutsk, and then eventually he returned to Moscow.
Ladika, what years were these again?
What's that?
What years were these again?
I'm not sure of the exact years. I think it was around 1853 that he returned. He became bishop around 1842. About 1853, he was in Eastern Asia, and by about and then when Saint Philaret of Moscow died, he went to Moscow and was elected to his position. But he also retired. He'd been born in 1798. He was already 62 years old there in 1860, and his health had suffered very greatly because of the because of the extreme weather and the extreme conditions that he had lived in. So here's more stuff. So you can tell he got around. While he was the See of Metropolitan of Moscow was it, and the Metropolitan of St. Petersburg were the two primary sees in the Russian Orthodox Church. But this was still under the Romanov dynasty, and so the patriarchate had been suppressed. And so what ruled the Russian Orthodox Church was actually a holy synod, which was chaired by a layman who was a state official instead of a patriarch. So this this was a way of trying to keep the church under control and make it a state institution, essentially. It took the downfall of the Romanov dynasty for that to be withdrawn. But it was not in the first place, it was uncanonical, and in the second place, it just didn't work very well. But the church was subject to it for over 200 years. But nevertheless, people worked for it. While he was Metropolitan of Moscow, Saint Innocent started the Russian Missionary Society. And this is a really proved to be an extremely fruitful organization which sponsored missionary work throughout the entire country and actually in remote places, even outside the borders of the country. For example, the Russian Missionary Society continued to support the mission in America, not just in Alaska, which was sold to the United States, I believe in 1872, but built many churches in America all the way up until 1917. It also paid the salaries for many of the clergy who were throughout America, and enabled them to do their ministries. So it was a really remarkable thing. And within that, he had a whole vision of how missionary work should be done, which he tried to incarnate and inculcate and train people to use and to apply that vision in their missionary work. So that by the end of the 19th century, the liturgy was being celebrated in almost 200 languages within the Russian Empire. There was no dominance of Slavonic required even within the borders of Russia itself. The most important thing was that the people would be able to understand and participate in the liturgy of the church. So I want to read a few passages. One of the most famous, let's see. Okay. One of the most famous things that happened to Saint Innocent was that here he was based in Unalaska, in Dutch Harbor, and he was visiting his parishioners. So he had made his way all the way over to Ahkun Island, which might be interesting to see what it's like. Of course, he went by kayak, and this was the place where he encountered this remarkable shaman. And I'll read the account. This is on page 132 of the Alaska Missionary Spirituality. During my stay in April of 1828 on the island of Ahkun and the other 3 islands belonging to the former, I learned through the interpreter Ivan Pankov that the resident of the village Reshchenskaya, or Recheshnaya, on the island of Ahkun, on its southeast side, about 10 versts from the main settlement on the island, Ivan Smerenikov, an old man of about 60 years of age, was regarded by the local inhabitants and by many others as well as a shaman, not an ordinary person at least. The wife of the Toyan, that is the chief of the village, Artelnovskaya, when Fyodor Zhirov on October of 1825 was caught in a fox trap, and her leg was badly hurt. There were no means to help her, and she was expected to die momentarily. The trap hit her at the kneecap by all 3 iron teeth, about 2, so about 3 inches in length. Her kinsman secretly asked the said old man Smerenikov to heal her, and thinking the matter over, he said that the patient will be well by morning. And indeed, the woman rose in the morning from her deathbed and is even now entirely well, not suffering any pain. Skip that. Last fall, I planned to visit Ahkun, but because of the arrival of state ships from Russia, I had to postpone the trip. Yet the Ahkun people sent an escort, and all expected my arrival. Only Smerenikov boldly asserted that I would not come that fall, but should be expected next spring. And so it happened. Contrary winds did not permit my departure. Then the cold weather set in, and I was forced to delay my visit until spring. There are many additional instances which prove his gift of clairvoyance, but I shall omit them here. Such tales, confirmed by trustworthy informants, convinced me that I should meet Smerenikov in person and personally inquire how it is that he knows the future and what means does he employ to learn it. He thanked me for my interest and told me the following. Soon after being baptized by Haramuk Makari, there appeared to him first 1, then 2 spirits, not to be seen by any other men. The spirits had the appearance of humans, light of face, dressed in white robes, and according to his description, these robes resembled church vestments and were trimmed with rose bands. They told him they were sent to him by God to instruct, teach, and preserve him, and they continued to appear to him for 30 years almost daily. The spirits instructed him in Christian teaching. They granted his requests and through him requests of others, though pretty seldom. They repeated to him my own teachings and told him not to confess his sins to anyone, to listen to my teachings and not to listen to the Promisleniki, that is the Russians. Even this very day, when he was en route, they appeared and told him that I am calling him, and for what reason, and instructed him to tell me all, not to be afraid, and that no evil shall befall him. I asked him, what did he feel when the spirits appeared, sorrow or joy? He said that only if he was conscious of having done something bad did he feel a twinge of conscience, but otherwise he did not experience any fear. Moreover, as the people regard him as a shaman, and he does not want to be a shaman, he asked the spirits to leave him alone. The spirits replied they are not demons and cannot leave him. To his question, why they do not appear to others, the spirits replied that they were so ordered. It is possible to suppose that this man has heard from me or from somebody else the teaching of our faith, he recounted, and only for our effect or out of vanity invented the appearance of spirits. Yet I must state that Aleuts do not fall prey to pride, vanity, and empty bragging. Moreover, I, when preaching for the sake of brevity and in order to avoid complications, omitted the story of creation, the fall of angels, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, of the first murder, of Noah, Abraham, and John the Baptist, and usually also the story of the Annunciation of the birth of Christ. But he, Smerenikov, told me these stories in detail. When I preached, he was the first to confirm the truth of my words in the tone of a person conversant with the Holy Writ. 2. Aleuts who live here, all except the interpreter Pankov and very few others, even though they had faith and prayed prior to my arrival, had little knowledge to whom they pray. Hieromonk Makari, my predecessor here, in 1794 and 1795, this is, in other words, this is over 30 years later, did not instruct the people here for lack of any kind of interpreter. It is only very recently that interpreters are on hand, and among them Pankov is the best and most intelligent. One second here, I'm going to see if I can clear my throat.
Was like that.
What's that? All right. But he, Pankov, afraid to fall into error, and having firm faith in the one God, never entered into any conversations with the old man, and he also protested and tried to restrain others when they called on the help of Smerenikov. The fact was attested by many Aleuts, and therefore there was no one from whom Smerenikov could have learned in the matters of church teaching. He himself is illiterate and does not know any Russian. Therefore, he could not have read about it, and finally, I asked him if I could meet with his protectors, the spirits. He replied that he does not know, but that he will ask. Shortly thereafter, in about an hour, he came and told me their answer. What does he want? Does he consider us demons? If he insists, he can see and converse with us. And then they said something very flattering to me, which I omit here, but I refused the meeting with the spirits. One could ask why I did so. My answer is that there was no need for me to meet them. Why should I want to see them personally when their teaching is Christian teaching? Out of curiosity to learn who they are, for this I should ask the blessing of my archbishop to avoid the pitfall of error should I meet the spirits. All of the above is attested by Smerenikov under oath and transmitted by me not word for word, but true to the meaning without additions or omissions. Moreover, the freedom, fearlessness, and even pleasure of his discourse, and above all his clean manner of life, convinced me and confirmed me in the conviction that the spirits which appear to this old man, if they appear, are not demons. Demons may sometimes assume the image of angels of light, but never for the purpose of instruction, teaching, and salvation of human beings, but always for their perdition. As the tree of evil cannot bear the fruit of good, these spirits must be the servants sent to those who seek salvation. Therefore, in order not to weaken among the people the faith and hope in the one omniscient God, until I receive instruction from your grace, this is a letter to the bishop, determined to render the following decision. I see that the spirits which appear to thee are not demons, and therefore I instruct thee to listen to their teachings and instructions, as long as these do not contradict the teachings I deliver in the assembly. Just tell those who ask your advice about the future and request your help to address themselves directly to God, as he is common Father to all. I do not forbid you to cure the sick, but ask you to tell those that you cure that you do so not by your own power, but by the power of God, and to instruct them and to pray diligently, and to thank the one God. I do not forbid thee to teach either, but only instruct thee to confine this teaching to the minors. I told the other Aleuts who were present not to call him a shaman, not to ask him for favors, but to ask God. So, one of the things that you'll find in this book, which is quite interesting, and there's a lot of material here, is the, you have both his diary and the diary of the, of Saint Iakov Netsvetov. There's also a lot of other really interesting material. And if you look at on page 238, for those who can, you have the instructions from Bishop Innocent Benjamin of Hiram of Theophan. It's essential instructions concerning a missionary's duties. And it's quite a number of pages, so I won't read it. But it's very fascinating. Does anybody have any questions or any comments about this?
I have one question from 139. Each priest that was assigned had to take a special oath.
Right.
I'm not sure I understand that.
Well, it was a mission. It was a I don't know. The Russians were and still are actually. When you're ordained as a priest in the Russian Orthodox Church, you have to take a couple of different oaths. One is that you've never been a Mason, for example, and then there's a whole oath of the priesthood that you have to sign, basically now, and it's a which includes that you won't cut your hair or beard, at least in Rokor. In the rest of the church, I'm not so sure that applies. But that's nothing uncommon in the Russian Orthodox Church. So,
well, this is very antithetical to what you hear about Protestant missionaries in Hawaii and that sort of thing. You disown all hypocrisy and avarice, all threats, deceit, extortions, and other unlawful acts. And without any force of violence, but sincerely, disinterestedly, kindly, considerately, with true meekness and Christian love, keeping in mind the glory of God and his salvation of his people's souls as the final aim of all my thoughts. It's very interesting that you would take a special oath to be in that missionary service.
Well, yeah. I'm not sure if if St. Innocent actually wrote this. It's very likely. But it's very likely he did, because he gave this to all of his missionary candidates in his dioceses. Because both dioceses were entirely missionary. You know, and by that time, by the 1840s, there was already a very substantial missionary movement going on, especially from Protestants as well as from Roman Catholics, and it was very often not a happy you know, it was not a very positive thing. A lot of people would go in and extort conversions. They would buy conversions. They would do all sorts of. They would use and abuse the people. They would enslave the native peoples. The Spanish were horrific at that. And of course, St. Innocent had direct experience of the Spanish missions, direct personal experience. And then, of course, he eventually knew about St. Peter the Aleut and his what happened with him. So it's it's really quite a remarkable thing how the Russian missions were done. In other words, with great humility, and the missionaries ended up being loved by the people. So many of the Spanish missionaries were hated by the native peoples because they enslaved them and were brutal towards them. So it's
this landscape would seem very intimidating 175 years ago, and I find it amazing now. But if you were in a kayak, I would think, my Lord, how am I going to survive here?
Yeah. One of the, let's see. We'll move on to Saint Iakov. If you're interested in reading more of the primary material about Saint Innocent, I really advise you to get the book. Richard, were you able to get this new, or is it still in print, or was it used?
It's used, and it was relatively inexpensive. It was about half the cover price from 1987.
Well, that's pretty good.
That included shipping, so that's not bad.
That's really good.
It's in perfect condition.
What's the name of the book again?
Alaskan Missionary Spirituality.
Got it. Thanks.
Ladika, it seems like there's possibly a new edition as well.
Really?
On Amazon. A second edition.
Okay. All right. So let's do this. Okay. We'll move to St. Iakov. St. Innocent had been stationed in Unalaska, and so his parish basically was like this. St. Yaakov's parish was like this end of the Aleutian chain. Now it's very interesting that during World War II, the Americans invaded some of this area and used the cupolas and the crosses on the Orthodox churches there as target practice.
You mean the Japanese?
No, the Americans.
Oh.
The Japanese invaded, but the Americans the Americans were the ones who shot up the churches, from what I understand. Anyway, it was a brutal time for everybody. And maybe they both shot up the churches. But Saint Iakov was from Atka, from this little island, and this is what it looks like. You can see the church. There's only a couple of photos. I don't know how much larger the village is then, but now it's apparently a rather large fishing port. So, but there's not much to see, even by satellite. He was born there. He was a Creole. In other words, he was half native, half Russian. He was educated in Yakutsk. In Yakutsk, he went to seminary, married a Russian woman, and came back to establish the church in Atka, in his home village. Now, one of the things about the Aleuts is they would live in the village during the winter, but in the summer they would go onto rivers on the island and have fish camps where they would catch the fish that were coming up the rivers and then process them. In other words, they would smoke them, and that would supply their food for the entire rest of the year. And then they would bring all of that back and settle in by the time the cold weather returned. So in the villages, the missionaries would essentially have a kind of a captive audience. But the villages were not large, couple hundred people maybe. But the people were, they were very quick to accept Orthodoxy, to accept as far as they could, and being half Aleut himself, Saint Iakov already knew the language, and so he also worked very closely with Saint Innocent, who was his neighbor, only a few hundred miles away, in the translation and the editing of the books that were being translated into the Aleut language. At a certain point, and we'll read some of Saint Iakov's diaries. He was sent to a Yupik village. Now the Aleuts and the Yupiks are traditional enemies. Basically, the Aleuts have this, the Alaska Peninsula and the islands, but the Yupiks are in this part of Alaska, which is the Yukon Delta and the Kuskokwim Delta. Then up here are Inuits, who never became Orthodox. However, you can see that even from the satellite, the Yukon River is this immense, immense river. And here's Fairbanks, Denali, all that. Saint Iakov, at 50 years old, after the death of his wife, was sent by Saint Innocent, who was his bishop, to missionize the Yupik peoples. in both river basins, and he had his headquarters here at Russian Mission. At one point, the Athabascans, who were from central Alaska, came and got him and took him upriver. And there they converged on whatever village it was, I don't remember the name, and he preached and taught and converted them. He preached for 3 days, he baptized for 3 days, and hundreds of people came to Orthodoxy. Now, one of the things that's unique about this is at the time, I don't think that St. Iakov spoke any Athabascan. Athabascans are a totally different people than Yupiks. Yupiks are one of two groups of Eskimos, and who are also related to the Aleuts. They're very small, very Asian looking, very gentle, and the culture on the whole is very peaceful. The Athabascans are quite different than that. Athabascans are Indians. The Athabascans actually, it's thought that that they were a later migration from Asia, that they came over maybe as late as the first 1,000 years ago. And initially they settled in here, and then there's a huge Athabascan community in northwestern Canada. And then two major groups of Athabascans came down here. The first were the Apaches, and the second are the Navajo.
Wow.
And they all speak mutually intelligible languages, because it was not very long ago that the languages differentiated. But the culture is basically very similar all throughout. So they have a totally different culture than many of the others. Now with the Yupiks and the Inuits go all the way to Greenland, and this whole area has got Inuits, and all the way across Russia, northern Russia. And the people still maintain contact among one another. With the Yupiks, they've been in this area for God knows how long, probably well over 1,000 years. But it takes a very kind of special, it's a very kind of special adaptation to live in a place like southwestern Alaska. The Athabascans, whereas the Yupiks lived in, and today live in settled villages, but would go to fish camps, the Athabascans tend to now have villages, but previously they were much more nomadic. So, and it's when they converted to Orthodoxy, it wasn't Russian Orthodoxy. It wasn't Aleut Orthodoxy. It wasn't Yupik Orthodoxy. It was uniquely Athabascan Orthodoxy. And what I would love to do is have some people from central Alaska go down to New Mexico and talk to the Navajos. I think it would be very interesting. Now, after he had evangelized the Athabascans, he got sent to Sitka, which is way down here. Which is, again, it's a totally different people than his own people, the Aleuts, or any of the others, the Athabascans or others. The main people are the Tlingits, and let's see if I can find this. Okay. Somebody had created some problems for Saint Yaakov, and so he got called to the carpet and to the bishop in Sitka, and of course was acquitted. But he remained there because of his advanced age. He was in his 60s, early 60s, and ended up dying there. But the church here is like right in the middle of town. There's a kind of circle drive that goes around it, and this was the capital of the entire of all of Russian America. One of the things that you see in this part of southeastern Alaska, these were the cultures, the Tlingit and the Haida and so forth, were the cultures that produced the big totem poles. They lived in huge wooden houses, and there would often be, and the totem poles would sometimes be the main post holding up the house, which of course would be intricately carved, and then there would be a door here, the main door into the house. It's a fascinating culture. The Tlingits are totally different, again, than the Athabascans or than the Yupiks and Aleuts. They're very tall, like 6'5", 6'6", whereas the Aleuts and Yupiks are just a little over 5 feet. They're very warlike, and in other words, they can be kind of scary. They're big guys, and they're strong, and they're boisterous, and they're very determined, and they were well known for the wars against their enemies. Now there must be, it's a nice shot. So I want to read a little bit. Okay, this is from St. Iakov's diaries on his visit to the island of Amlia, which was an island adjacent to Atka. March 14th, not sure what year, 1831. March 14th, the prayer tent was secured with a view to a prolonged stay. I have arranged the interior as far as possible to do so, and on this same night held the evening service. March 15th, on the second Sunday of Lent, I celebrated in the tent the Divine Liturgy and joined in the Holy Mysteries 10 infants. I continued to celebrate divine services throughout the following week. In the interim, I offered instruction to the Aleuts in the necessary Christian concepts through the intermediate of their Toyan chief. At this time, I could not yet engage them in lengthy explanations, but related to them only through the mysteries of religion. March 19th. Through the entire Holy Thursday, I confessed those who had fasted. Of these, there were 22 persons of both sexes. March 20th was also busy confessing those who fasted. Of these, there were 27 persons of both sexes. Remark, the above-mentioned persons who fasted were divided by me into 2 groups for confession as they were preparing for the first time after performance of this to receive Holy Communion. They required, therefore, detailed and prolonged explanation, which was not easy to give, and thus I spent these 2 days with them, assisting them in cleansing their consciences. One of the things that's interesting to note is that even though these groups were not that large, you would have a different dialect in each village. And so the dialect that was spoken in Atka was may not have been understandable or entirely mutually intelligible with Amlia or with Adak or with these other villages along the line. March 21st, this day, the Holy Saturday at the liturgy, joined in the Holy Mysteries 47 persons who had made their confessions. On March 22nd, on the 3rd Sunday of Lent in the morning, anointed with the holy myrrh 5 infants of both sexes born in the course of the past year. In other words, they were baptized by a layman, and who were later on at the liturgy joined in the Holy Mysteries up to 30 infants. Throughout the next week, continued to celebrate the divine services in the same order and manner as in the preceding week. The 24th, throughout the entire day instructed and confessed the minors, of whom there were 71 persons of both sexes, minors referring children. I was preparing them for the forthcoming feast, and also because there were so many people who fasted this week. So he was busy, to say the least. Skip over to July 6th. On the night of July 7th, the will of the one whose providence and decisions on fate are unfathomable and whose deeds are not to be grasped by man, my house where once I, within the circle of my family, was content and at times found happiness, in spite of all the lack, poverty, and meagerness met in this desert, which is Atka, went up into the air in flames. Thus at 2 o'clock past midnight, while there was no light or fire anywhere in the house at all, and everyone was asleep, it ignited. The fire started in the top story and spread to the foundation. Throughout the night and while the wind was light, the fire burned so hot that one could not approach it to put it out. We salvaged the very few belongings as much as we could, just from the lower apartments. The rest and all that was on the second story burned, just as the entire house structure, which by daybreak was completely consumed. On the spot where the house used to be, there is now but bare earth. And the diary just continues, and almost every day he's celebrating services and joining people to the church. Um, there's another, this is November 13th, a couple of years later, when he was already in the Yukon. November 13th, this day the Kuskokwim River was reached, and the party arrived at the village Kalkagbiut. Hence we met the Creole Konstantin Lukin. He was dispatched by his father from Kalmakovsky Redoubt for Ikogbiut to join the mission and assume his office as sacristan in accordance with the order of the consistory. He joined the missionaries' party as they continued upstream along the Kuskokwim. By evening, the party reached the village Ukagmiut, where they stayed the night in the native kajim, a large yurt. On this occasion, the missionary preached the word of God to the local inhabitants, the Kuskokwim people, through his interpreter, the above-mentioned Konstantin Lukin. On the 16th, this day the church services commenced and were held in the prayer house, which is small and simple, and serves here at Kalmakovsky Redoubt as the chapel named for the Transfiguration. The faithful, the local inhabitants, commenced preparation for communion, and between services, instructions was given them as needed. In between, on the same day, anointed with holy myrrh, 7 infants, 2 male, 5 female, all except one born of Christians and baptized by laymen, after the visit here by the Nushagak missionary in 1843. So anyway, you get the idea. Saint Yaakov ended his life there in Sitka, and was a faithful disciple of Saint Innocent. In Sitka, they also had the seminary where missionaries were trained and were sent to work in various parts of Alaska. Almost all of these missionaries were native Alaskans. They were not Russians. So, okay, let's see. So does anybody have have any questions, comments?
Hi, Vladimir.
Yeah.
I have a question. You mentioned that Athabascans were special in some way. They converted to some special Orthodoxy. It was not really Russian Orthodoxy. So what's so special about their Orthodoxy?
Well, in other words, it had no cultural. They did not have to receive the cultural content of Russian culture. It had certain marks that it came from Russia, but it's something that became uniquely Aleut, uniquely Yupik, uniquely Athabascan, uniquely Tlingit. Just like eventually there'll be a uniquely American Orthodoxy, but we're a long way from that. And this is really part of the that essential vision, which I think is something so important, that we, we're not, if Orthodoxy is going to be successful in a culture where it's brought to from, it's not because of some kind of cultural context. It's we don't take Orthodoxy to a place and then try and convert people to being Russians or being Greeks or being Serbs, and where that's being done, it fails inevitably, because in the first place, there's nothing, and this is an essential dogma of the faith. There is nothing divine about any human culture, and as Orthodox Christians, we're citizens of the kingdom of heaven, not of some earthly kingdom, or any kind of human distinction, any kind of ethnicity, race, class, even sex is not relevant to our identity in Christ. Obviously, if we're male and if we're men, we're men. We're women, we're women, and that's essential to our identity and can't be changed. But all of these other things, all of these strictly human divisions, ultimately have to be transcended. While we may be citizens of one culture and one country or another, that ultimately has no bearing on our orthodoxy. One of the greatest temptations for orthodoxy in America has been the hijacking of the mission of the Orthodox Church into chaplaincy to ethnic communities. And while it's very valuable to serve various ethnic communities and to use the languages that they need, it can't be at the expense of the mission of bringing local people to Orthodoxy, bringing local people to Christ. So one of the things that I want to read to close for tonight is Saint Innocent's reflections on the mission in relation to the sale of Alaska to So a few months after Alaska, and St. Innocent writes, a few months after Alaska had been transferred to American rule, Archbishop Ennikenny wrote from Siberia to the Overprocurator of the Holy Synod. Rumor reaching me from Moscow purports that I wrote to someone of my great unhappiness about the sale of our colonies to the Americans. This is utterly false. To the contrary, I see in this event one of the ways of providence by which Orthodoxy will penetrate the United States, where even now people have begun to pay serious attention to it. Were I to be asked about this, I would reply, 1, do not close the American diocese, even though the number of churches and missions there has been reduced by half. That is 5. And this is probably around 1860. B, designate San Francisco rather than New Archangel, Sitka, the residence of the bishop. The climate is incomparably better there, and communications with the colonial churches are just as convenient from there as from New Archangel, if not more so. C, subordinate the diocese to the Bishop of St. Petersburg or some other Baltic diocese. For once the colonies have been sold to the American government, communications between the Amur and the colonies will end completely, and all communications between the headquarters of the Diocese of Kamchatka and Alaska will be through St. Petersburg, which is completely unnatural. This must have been when he was in Yakutsk. D, return to Russia the present bishop and all the clergy at Sitka, except readers and wardens, and appoint a new bishop from among those who know the English language. Likewise, his retinue ought to be composed of all those who know English. E, allow the bishop to augment his staff, transfer its members, and ordain to the priesthood for our churches converts to Orthodoxy from among American citizens who accept all its institutions and customs. F, allow the vicar bishop and all the clergy of the Orthodox Church in America to celebrate the liturgy and other services in English, for which purpose, obviously, the service books must be translated into English. And G, to use English rather than Russian, which must sooner or later be replaced by English in all instruction in the schools to be established in San Francisco and elsewhere to prepare people for ordination and missionary work. So that was St. Innocent's vision for Orthodoxy in America, even before he had become the Metropolitan of Moscow. And so the mission continued, not with Russian clergy, but with Native American clergy. And in 1872, Alaska was purchased in 1867. In 1872, the diocese was transferred to San Francisco. San Francisco had had a parish since 1850. But by 1870, this time in the 1870s, they were already using English substantially. Of course, there were very few, if any, Russians there. It was mainly Serbs and Greeks, including the, at that time, newly born, now Saint Sebastian Dabovich, who grew up at the San Francisco Cathedral and later went on to organize the Serbian communities throughout the country. So do we have any, does anybody have any questions, comments? Yeah, Frank?
Oh, no, I was going to say then, so St. Innocent put this Christ first and not, I mean, it's very far-sighted to read what he's talking about.
Yes,
what you just read. It was centered on Christ and not on, it's not a nationalistic message.
Exactly. So we need to heed the words of Saint Innocent. So Nobody else has anything?
Vladika, it's basically what you said at our baptism. If you ever wonder why I joined this strange Eastern religion,
Uh-huh.
it's not the strangeness of the appearance or the beauty of the icons or anything like that. It's all about Jesus, really. St.
Exactly.
Innocent realized that.
And I think that's one of the things that we need to emphasize in our missionary work. Being Orthodox is a deeper stage in a deeper commitment to Christ. It's all about our commitment to Christ and our commitment to being a Christian. You know, and that's not to say that there aren't Christians outside the Orthodox Church, but I think that we have found in Orthodoxy that highest expression of Christianity. So, nobody else has anything? Okay, well, it's a little after 9 o'clock, so I think we'll end up here. And God willing, we'll see you next week. Now, what do you all think? Do you like this format better than the in-person classes?
Well, I like the in-person classes, but especially tonight, we don't have to worry about a curfew or anything else that's going on.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, even at times, I imagine that, I mean, I organize events for a living, and I've noticed that, you know, the in-person events, not everyone can make, but live streaming always will attract more than can show up in person.
Yeah.
And not just now during this lockdown and house arrest situation, you know, putting
Yeah.
everyone under house arrest, but
Close.
but it's but yes, people will there are a lot of people who can't travel to the location. So but some people are talking about when we can do in-person events again to go to a hybrid format where it's streamed as well as,
Yeah.
you know, but I think we're doing that no, I guess we don't live stream. I think we
No.
record.
No.
So
No, people have to call in.
right.
So, well, good. Okay, well, let's pray. It is truly me to bless thee, O Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compared than the seraphim, who without corruption gave us birth, the God, the Word, true Theotokos, we magnify thee. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always now and ever and unto ages of ages. Amen.
Amen.
God bless you. Hope everybody has a joyous Pentecost. And so we'll be remembering you all in prayer.
Well, where you gave us a blessing, but I did have a question. It's not exactly related to this topic. And is it permissible? I know that the Western churches don't allow it, but to do confession over the telephone?
Sure. I do lots of telephone confessions.
What about absolution?
I just read the prayer.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I do telephone, text message, email, Facebook Messenger sometimes. So
I thought you had to, the imposition of hands, you know.
That's the best by far. But, you know, if I'm praying for you, it doesn't matter whether I'm 2 feet away or 20 miles or 200 miles or 500 miles. Still praying for you.
Right. I didn't know.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Now, one thing that will not work, though, is for you to set some bread and wine in front of the computer screen. And when the priest says the words of institution, think that that bread and wine has become the communion.
Oh,
That doesn't
okay.
work. So,
All right.
all
Yeah,
right.
no, that I didn't think.
Yeah. Have you all been keeping up on the this controversy going on about communion spoons and all of that stuff?
Well, I know there's been some in the Roman Catholic world. There's been some medical doctors who have studied it, and they said that communion on the tongue or in the hand is, of course, we don't do that in the hand, but some of the Catholic bishops think in the hand is safer. It's really not. They're finding that it's not any. Yeah, so I don't know.
Well, I think somebody put it very well, that if you don't have the faith to believe that the communion of the body and blood of Christ is not going to make you sick, then you probably shouldn't be taking communion. Because then you really don't believe that it's the body and blood of Christ. And that's a little on the strong side, but I think, we have to discern the body. We have to recognize that this is not, the communion is not just bread and wine. That there's something that it has been transformed, and that it bears the very presence of Christ. And and that's not going to make us sick. The other thing, and especially in this particular instance, it's a respiratory illness.
Right.
Eat something, it's not going to give you the virus.
That's some I have heard that as well.
Yeah.
It's not the way it is transmitted. Right.
On the other hand, I think it's also worthwhile saying that in a sense it shouldn't. Of course, our tradition is that we share a common spoon, and it's going to remain that way until I'm instructed differently. But it shouldn't make a difference whether we use a common spoon or whether we give communion in the hand. There's one bishop who said that they would use the rules of the liturgy of St. James, which is communion in the hand. In other words, the laity would receive like a deacon receives, or a priest, or a bishop, for example. Of course, we need much larger loaves than we use. But what matters is the communion and not so much the matter of distribution.
Adika,
yeah.
One thing that confuses me about the spoon controversy is that it's being washed in the body and the blood of Christ every time it's dipped back into the chalice.
Absolutely.
So it seems like we're playing it off of both sides to say, well, the body and blood can't, but this very utensil that gets washed in it, maybe it could. It just seems kind of ridiculous.
I agree, and that's why we use one spoon.
Well, Vladika, there's one other aspect, and that's whether the government has the power to close these churches. And I ran into that last week in Miami. They closed St. Vladimir's to communicants.
Really?
And finally, Father, I put in a call because I wanted to attend liturgy for Ascension. And he called me back about 9 o'clock and told me what the city of Miami required, that no parishioners be there. So, but he sent me to the all Slavonic ceremony somewhere in Hialeah. But I had already eaten some. I did confession, but I had eaten some oatmeal or something by 9 o'clock, so I didn't take communion. But they didn't abide by any of those restrictions. You know, they gave normal liturgy and
Yeah,
communion.
which is pretty much what we're doing.
Yep.
And at St. Herman's, and you know, and also, I mean, I saw those. You know, there was actually a letter written by Fauci, who wanted to eliminate the celebration of the Eucharist during the pandemic.
Yeah.
And I'm very grateful that one of my parishioners, we share with St. John's, who's the head of OPM, Orthodox Office of Personnel Management, strongly objected and sent it to the, you know, up to the next level where that was quashed. But had they done that, you might have to come visit me in jail.
Well, that was the sense of my question: is how much of this do you tolerate? You know, before you just say we're going to break the rules because it's the body and blood of Christ is more important than your rules.
Well, it is, and they have absolutely no constitutional right to say what happens inside a church building. So, or in the structure of the church. So, anyway, our country needs prayer because we're in a very precarious and very sad situation.
Reminds me of the Bolshevik Revolution.
Yeah, we're probably what?
1915.
No, I think we're in 1917.
So 1917. Okay, maybe we are.
Yeah. Yeah. It's either that or 1936 in Berlin. I think more the latter sometimes than the former. So anyway, so okay, well, everybody stay safe and have a good Pentecost, and liturgy starts at 10 on Pentecost. So for those who I can see there, that'd be great. Okay.
Thank you, Vatican.
Thank you.
God bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Bye.